Undoubtedly, one of the best educational institutions for training hunters. Against the backdrop of high gray mountains stretching to the blue skies, stood a multi-story beautiful building with many windows and balconies. Valhalla. Every year, countless applicants apply for the honor of bearing the name of this institution. Many boys and girls with different hairstyles, outfits, and weapons walked forward resolutely. Someone demonstrated the strength of their muscles, someone carried a bat on their shoulder. They were all different, but had a common goal. With a competition of 500 people per place. Many of them were killed. Their motionless bodies formed a large heap. Even 150 people would hardly be able to finish Valhalla. The competition begins with distribution. There was a fight between two guys in dark blue pantsuits. The blonde guy raised his leg high and hit his opponent on the head with force. His leg glowed brightly with blue spiritual power. The large room was divided into square booths, in each of which there were fights between students. Guys fought in several booths, striking their opponents with their hands and feet, leaving magical luminous traces in the air. In some booths, students could be seen who were armed with swords that glowed with spiritual power. A gray-haired man in a gray jacket watched all this from above, from the balcony. Valhalla's top-ranking instructor, Lee Sang-cheol, crossed his arms over his chest and looked down with a serious expression on his face. He was an adult man with gray hair, a short mustache and beard. He looked thoughtfully at the students and thought, wow, there's a whole crowd of them this time too. Lee Sang-cheol heard footsteps next to him and glanced sideways. Standing next to him was the heir of the Yushin family, Yu Minjin. A dark-haired young man dressed in a gray shirt with a gray tie, a gray vest, and a gray trouser suit silently looked at the instructor. Lee Sang-cheol turned his head towards him, looked at him and said, during the selection process, there are always enough applicants. He asked the question, so he came to see his niece? Yu Minjin leaned on the metal railing of the balcony and answered, exactly. His family has very high expectations of Soyeon. Lee Sang-cheol repeated thoughtfully, Yu Seon. Yu Seon, a slender girl with long blue hair, dressed in a dark blue student uniform. She was a genius born into the Yushin family, one of the top 5 families in Korea. At the age of 10, she could freely use mana on a par with high school students. At age 13, she managed to catalyze mana into her own sword. At the age of 16, she caught up with the members of the Yushin family, subsequently becoming the undisputed leader among them. Yu Seon stood among the defeated men who lay motionless on the ground. She was holding her sword in her hands. Her aura glowed blue. Lee Sang-cheol, after listening to this information, said that this was written in the archives with her personal data. He asked with interest, is there anything else he doesn't know about? Yu Minjun smiled mysteriously, moved closer to the instructor and said, they say she can interact with the patron constellation of their family. Lee Sang-cheol became wary. He frowned and looked at Yu Minjun sternly. He asked the question, can he believe it? Lee Sang-cheol asked incredulously, what? Is he telling the truth? Yu Minjun looked at him conspiratorially and said, of course, that's why they expect so much from her. The reason why there are 5 families in Korea is due to the guardian constellations that protect each of the families. Usually the hunter receives a blessing or enters into a contract with the guardian constellation. However, the guardian constellations of the top 5 families are different from the rest. Constellation of the Yushin family, God of the Sword. A young man with long black hair gathered at the back of his head, dressed in a light gray kimono and a dark blue cape. His hands are wrapped in white bandages. He holds in his hand a sharp long sword, from which a blue glow emanates. Constellation of the Changsan family, Holy Spear. A young man with short purple hair, wearing a light purple kimono and a dark purple cape. In his hand, he holds a sharp spear with a purple tip. There is a purple glow emanating from him and his weapon. Constellation of the Choijin family, King of Tao. A muscular, strong guy with short dark hair. With both hands he holds a sword with a red hilt, from the tip of which a red glow emanates. His aura is red in color, resembling flames. Constellation of the Osun family, the King of Fist Fighting. He is a strong guy with long blonde hair tied at the back of his head. He thrust forward a powerful fist that glowed with gray spiritual power. The clothes and equipment of the king of fistfights are bright yellow. Constellation of the Dajin family, the bow god. A man in a light hat with a white feather and a green cloak holds a bow in one hand, and with the other pulls back an arrow, the tip of which glows with a golden aura. Members of each of the 5 families received blessings from their patron constellations. They were endowed with greater abilities and talents than others. Lee Sang-chul crossed his arms over his chest, bowed his head, and thought. There is a huge difference between receiving a simple blessing and directly contracting a constellation. Communication with the patron god occurs thanks to a contract concluded with him. Lee Sang-chul said, "If this is true, undoubtedly this girl is a genius." Yu Minjin put out his index finger, pointing somewhere to the side, and asked again, right? He asked how his niece was doing. Lee Sang-chul looked at him and replied that apparently she hasn't started yet. He assumed that now that he looked at the site, she would start soon. About 30 seconds later, Yu Minjin looked at the instructor and clarified by asking a question. Really? He asked him to let him watch it. Lee Sang-chul. He said if he really wants to see it, then let him go down there in person. Yu Minjun asked in surprise, does he mean that he has to go through all these scouts and reporters? No, it's better for him to rest here. Our spectator stands were crowded. Many people came to watch and support the students at the competition. Reporters stood below, holding large cameras in their hands. Yu Minjun, leaning over the balcony railing, looked down and said, just let him bring the fight to the screen. He asked the question, isn't he his elder? Lee Sang-chul clarified, asking if he only remembered this now. He activated a blue screen in the air and said, well, since he was also interested, he would do it. An image of 2 competition participants appeared on the screen. Yu Sayan stood in front of her opponent, a dark-haired youth. Yu Minjun said happily, here she is. Information appeared on the screen opposite Yu Sayan's image, where it was written that this was the eldest daughter of the Yushin family, Yu Soyan, 17 years old. Next, an image of the main character appeared. In the information about him, there was nothing written about his family, only the name Kim Ju-hyuk, 17 years old. This is a guy with short, curly black hair. He is wearing a dark blue student uniform, a white shirt with a blue tie and a gray vest. His hands were protected by gloves. He looked calmly and confidently at his opponent Yu Sayan. Lee Sang-chul said that they seemed quite calm. Yu Minjun smiled and asked, isn't it because her opponent has already lost morally after knowing who his opponent is? Almost everyone has heard about her abilities. Yu Sayan calmly and resolutely looked at her opponent. Kim Ju-hyuk yawned out of boredom, covering his mouth with his hand. Lee Sang-chul, noticing this, said, even in this case, it seems to him that he has no fighting spirit at all. Yu Minjun smiled cheerfully and said, he is sure that this will end quickly. The countdown has begun. There were 3 seconds left before the fight. When the number 3 appeared on the screen, Yu Sayan quickly grabbed her blade from its sheath and stood in a fighting position. The sharp blade sparkled brightly, reflecting the light source. On the count of 2, Kim Ju-hyuk shook his head listlessly and kneaded his shoulder with his hand. His expression was bored. About 1, Yu Sayan resolutely flashed her bright purple eyes. The referee ordered them to begin. Yu Sayan quickly rushed at the enemy. She swung her sword, creating a magical stream of blue and white energy. Using her blade, she increased and expanded the energy flow, making it sharp. Yu Sayan sent a sharp stream that resembled a sharp sword blade at Kim Ju-hyuk. Lee Sang-chul, who was watching the fight, thought with delight that at such a young age she already had a refined manner of wielding a blade and such exceptional control of the flow of mana. Kim Ju-hyuk, with his hands down, stood calmly and looked at the magical flow approaching him. A sharp stream of mana had almost touched his face. Kim Ju-hyuk was calm and indifferent. There was an explosion. Lee Sang-chul. He frowned shockingly, not believing his eyes. Yu Minjun screamed desperately. The judge and the television cameraman sweated excitedly. The referee solemnly announced that Kim Ju-hyuk had won. He calmly held his bent hand clenched into a fist in front of him. His fist glowed brightly, filled with blue spiritual power. Yu Sayan lay motionless on the floor in front of him, holding a blade in her hand. Kim Ju-hyuk looked down at her in surprise and asked the question, "What is this?" Why is everyone here so weak? Is this really the future that happened 300 years from now? 300 years ago, Tower of Destruction. Against the backdrop of a dark, gloomy sky, a stone tower in the Gothic style rose. Stone spikes extended upward from this. The windows glowed blue. There was a purple ring spinning around the top of the tower. Opposite each other stood the main character and a demon with horns in a dark blue robe. The boss of the Tower of Destruction, Barch, laughed cheerfully and said that it was an amazing fight. He held his hand on the bloody clothes in the stomach area. Barch, a guy with white hair, on whose head 2 horns grew. His eyes were hidden under a blue-colored bandage. The main character, god of martial arts, Kim Hyun-oh, was holding his bloody clothes in his stomach area. His face was covered in cuts, bruises, and beads of sweat. He silently looked at his opponent, slightly bent over in pain. A moment later, he raised his black-booted foot over Barch's head. Kim Hyun-oh kicked him hard in the head and said menacingly, "Amazing fight." His aura was glowing bright pink at that moment. Barch fell to the floor dead. Kim Hyun-oh looked down at him and laughed cheerfully. A notification appeared on the system screen that he had defeated the boss of the Tower of Destruction, Barch, stopping the decay of the world. At that moment, the Tower of Destruction began to shake. A red light came on in the windows. Kim Hyun-oh fell to the floor, losing his balance and clutching his bloody stomach. He asked in surprise, "What?" The tower started collapsing because he killed the boss. Rocks were falling from above. Several stones fell on him. Kim Hyun-oh winced in pain. Drops of sweat ran down his face. Gritting his teeth, he groaned. Kim Hyun-oh removed his hand and saw a huge, bleeding wound on his stomach. He said excitedly that he wanted to finally relax. Leaning his back against the stone wall, he sadly looked up and thought that he had always been busy with something, and had worked as a hunter since childhood. It was when he earned some money and achieved recognition that a similar misfortune happened to him. The tower collapsed and huge boulders fell to the ground. Kim Hyun-oh mentally asked himself, should he have called his students? He remembered how he stopped a group of armed guys following him with a hand gesture. Kim Hyun-oh thought about it and decisively answered, no. He looked at Barch's motionless body and thought, if there's one thing you can't argue with, it's the freak's enormous strength. Even if they did appear, they died a terrible death. Kim Hyun-oh heard a sound, closed his eyes, and smiled sadly. He held his hand to the bleeding wound on his stomach. At that moment, a huge stone fell on his head from above. The pitch darkness was replaced by a bright white light. Kim Hyun-oh opened his eyes wide inside. He sat in bed and looked at his hands in surprise, his eyes widening in shock. Kim Hyun-oh reincarnated into the body of a 17-year-old teenager 300 years after the fall of the Tower of Destruction. In any case, for some time he was satisfied with his position. Even though his body was much weaker, the knowledge and experience that he had accumulated while still being a god of martial arts had not disappeared anywhere. Kim Joo-hyuk stood in front of a large window with a gray curtain, through which several multi-story buildings could be seen. He stood dressed in a white shirt and smiled with satisfaction. If only he could adapt to this body. Kim Joo-hyuk believed that this time he could live his life in luxury without doing anything. A black rectangle appeared with an image of some symbol on it. He looked at this with interest. That's what he thought before this translucent window appeared. It said that in 5 years a Tower of Destruction would appear. Please let him get ready. Kim Joo-hyuk excitedly tousled his hair with his palm and cursed angrily. He irritably asked a question. Did this freak harbor some kind of grudge against him or what? Kim Joo-hyuk thought Barky was a scoundrel. It was worth leaving him to the mercy of fate while there was such an opportunity. However, he still will not be able to influence the events of the past. Kim Joo-hyuk looked at the dark rectangle with the warning and thought that this time he would destroy the tower once and for all. Then he will finally be able to enjoy luxury and idleness. He imagined himself sitting on a soft purple sofa among a huge mountain of paper money, dressed in luxurious clothes and drinking some kind of burgundy drink from a crystal glass. Opposite, a black rectangle appeared again. Kim Joo-hyuk was surprised and asked what. On the black rectangle was written in white letters that he needed his weapons and memories back. This is located on the 3rd floor in the 5th room of Valhalla. Kim Joo-hyuk asked in surprise. Should we return the weapons and memories? Valhalla? Room? Constellations? He thoughtfully touched his chin with his fingers and said, he understands what kind of weapon we are talking about. Kim Joo-hyuk asked in surprise, didn't he regain all his previous memories? Looks like he'll have to find this Valhalla. After some time, the multi-story, beautiful building of Valhalla stood majestically against the bright blue sky. The referee solemnly announced that the fourth day of the competition for the title of 10 strongest begins. People who want to take part in competitions should go to the competition area. Kim Joo-hyuk sat on the bench and listened. Hearing this announcement, he sighed thoughtfully. Kim Joo-hyuk looked from afar at the competition site, stood up and thoughtfully asked the question, should he? After a while, he stood with his arms crossed on his chest on the competition floor opposite his opponent. The referee announced that the competitors should take their positions. Spectators in the stands excitedly shouted something and waved their hands, expressing support for the contestants. Behind them, a photographer was conducting a photo report. Lee Sang-chul stood on the spectator stand and looked down thoughtfully, crossing his arms over his chest. He thought that there were a lot of people there today, and all because representatives of all 5 families are in this place at the same time. He saw something below and frowned with displeasure. Lee Sang-chul noticed Kim Joo-hyuk and thought that the same newcomer was there. Kim Joo-hyuk stood with one hand hidden in his trouser pocket and looked at his opponent indifferently. The referee announced that there were 30 seconds left before the start of the match. Lee Sang-chul thought that the newcomer's opponent was the eldest son of the Osung family, Oh Se-hyuk, 17 years old. Oh Se-hyuk, a tanned, fair-haired, strong, muscular guy with white eyebrows and light blue eyes. He is wearing a tight white shirt with the sleeves rolled up to the elbows and light blue trousers. He looked carefully at his opponent and asked in disbelief, did this guy defeat Soyeon on the first day? Kim Joo-hyuk, dressed in a dark blue student uniform, was stretching his shoulder and arm. Oh Se-hyuk thought that he didn't look strong at all. Well, that's good. If he can defeat him, his reputation will increase significantly. Oh Se-hyuk closed his eyes and smiled smugly. He rudely called out to Kim Joo-hyuk. He looked at him in surprise and asked what. The 3-second countdown to the start of the match has begun. Oh Se-hyuk bared his snow-white teeth in a smug grin, stood in a fighting position, thrusting his powerful fists forward, and menacingly said that he would quickly knock him down. Kim Joo-hyuk asked in surprise, what does it mean? Was he going to shake him? The grin disappeared from Oh Se-hyuk's face. He said sternly, this means he will knock him out. 2 seconds left before the match starts. Kim Joo-hyuk smiled and said cheerfully, in that case, let it roll. 1 second left before the match starts. Oh Se-hyuk asked in bewilderment, what? Kim Joo-hyuk cheerfully smiled at him with a wide smile, showing off his white teeth, and made an obscene gesture with his hand. He said mockingly, this means let him get out of here. Jerk. The referee announced the start of the match. Oh Se-hyuk stood with his back turned. His whole body seemed to be engulfed in a bright orange flame. He was the eldest son of the Osun family. Oh Se-hyuk was not very good at literature, strategy, or martial arts. He had a talent that surpassed everything else. Oh Se-hyuk looked at everything behind him with a tenacious gaze. His talent was physicality. Oh Se-hyuk clenched his fist, fully tensing all the muscles in his arm. Sweat ran down his arms from the intense power and tension. Only thanks to his physical strength was he able to do what others would never have been able to do without using their mana. Oh Se-hyuk punched the wall with all his strength, making huge cracks in it from the impact. Just a little training could increase his strength exponentially. He was born with a first-class physique that did not require any effort to improve. Oh Se-hyuk punched the guy standing next to him, who unconsciously began to fall down. Oh Se-hyuk was worthy of being called a genius for this alone. Oh Se-hyuk looked ahead thoughtfully, frowning. He stood in a fighting pose, standing in front of Kim Joo-hyuk, who was watching him calmly. Kim Joo-hyuk grinned, made an obscene gesture with his finger, and said that he told him to leave here. He called him a moron. Oh Se-hyuk clenched his fist harder, aligning his teeth, and muttered that this one. He could not say a word from intense anger and indignation. Oh Se-hyuk began to rapidly run forward surrounded by a bright golden aura and shouted that this freak. Kim Joo-hyuk still continued to stand in place, making an obscene gesture with his hand. He put his other hand in his pocket. After a moment, he stopped showing his finger and thought that with his new body, he could not win in a direct physical confrontation with him. Kim Joo-hyuk didn't know how things were going with his other parameters, but with his strength, the jokes were very bad. He began to think further, watching O.C. Hyuk rapidly approaching him, and thought that, however, his physical superiority did not at all mean that he was victorious. O-seok began to wave his hand. A moment later, he struck forward with all his might, a wary expression on his face. Kim Joo-hyuk easily dodged this blow and thought that his art was used in conjunction with this physique. He glanced at O-seok's fist, which hit the slabs of the wall behind with all its strength. Kim Joo-hyuk sharply raised his leg bent at the knees and thought what it was. He hit O.C. Hyuk's leg, knocking him down. O.C. Hyuk began to fly down, looking at Kim Joo-hyuk in shock. Surprised and stunned, he began to utter some incoherent sounds that expressed his dissatisfaction. Kim Joo-hyuk winked at him and awkwardly put his hand to the side, as if he didn't understand what was happening. He immediately swung his palm and thought that this was an opportunity to observe the opponent. His palm began to move forward at a rapid speed. Kim Joo-hyuk hit the falling O-seok's chest with all his might, causing a huge blue blast wave. Blood began to flow out of O.C. Hyuk's mouth in drops, spattering his white shirt. He landed lifelessly on the floor, hitting his back hard. Kim Joo-hyuk stood over him, looking at him emotionlessly. He thought, if they are not in harmony, then something like this happens. He continued to look ahead calmly and thoughtfully. Someone's voice announced that Kim Joo-hyuk had won. Kim Joo-hyuk began to think further. Even though this body is weaker than what he had before reincarnation, he should not have any problems with hunting monsters and becoming hunters. Kim Joo-hyuk began to walk towards the exit of the building, putting his hands in his pockets. His steps echoed down the corridor. Many people in suits watched him through the projector screen. The girl crossed her arms over her chest and asked the question, was O-seok really knocked over and hit while he was carrying out his attack? The guy, writing something in a notebook with a pen, said he didn't think that O.C. Hyuk would be dealt with such a simple technique. All the other people behind them were covering their mouths with their hands in surprise. The man with blonde hair frowned, pressing his index finger to his chin. This was the head of the Osun family. His name was Oh Cholshan. He thought they were ignorant idiots. He asked a question in his mind. Do they call this simple technique? His aura curled menacingly next to him. He looked up and made a mental note. Even though his son had never shown any desire to learn martial arts, only working on his physical fitness, he thought a little and began to think further that he could easily dodge the fist of any of his peers. Oh Cholshan looked ahead menacingly and mentally concluded that this was something he could not avoid. He remembered O.C. Hyuk's punch as he was rapidly approaching Kim Joo-hyuk, and again concluded that his emotions had gotten the better of his reason, so he simply attacked his opponent. Oh Cholshan began to think further, remembering the huge cloud of aura next to O-seok's fist, and that, in addition, in order to complete the fight as quickly as possible, he used magic, which is used quite rarely. He remembered how Kim Joo-hyuk easily dodged the attack. He thought that he had only slightly tilted his head to dodge. Oh Cholshan again remembered the confused expression on O-seok's face and began to think further. Since he thought that Kim Joo-hyuk would definitely get hit, he completely shifted his center of gravity. Oh Cholshan again began to remember how Kim Joo-hyuk, with a slight movement of his foot, knocked O-seok off her feet, causing her to fall down. He remembered his hand raising to strike. Oh Cholshan thought again, putting his fingers on his chin, and concluded that he moved faster than O-seok. He began to think further that from the moment he stepped onto the set, Kim Joo-hyuk already had a plan prepared. He grinned, clenching his fist, and thought that in itself this was already a monstrous talent. Suddenly he heard strange sounds somewhere to the side. He looked thoughtfully in the direction of the sound. Oh Cholshan looked at all the people who stood in front of him. One of the guys with glasses was talking on the phone to someone in a raised voice. Another girl was sorting through a lot of papers in her hands, looking at it thoughtfully and tensely. Another guy was writing something down in a black pen on a notepad, his lips pursed tightly. Oh Cholshan said, unfortunately for him, There were many others who also realized the value of this new guy's skill. He added that not all of them are ignorant. Chulshan looked up and mentally said the name Kim Ju-hyuk. He looked at Kim Ju-hyuk, who was shown on the screen, walking and looking around with a cool gaze. Chulshan decided he will try, no matter what you do, to bring him to their family. Meanwhile, in a huge round building with many installations to support it, many projects stood on the stands, illuminating everything around. People shouted Choi Aaron's name in love and enthusiasm. Another person clasped his hands together, began to cry ecstatically, and shouted that he loved her. Kim Ju-hyuk clenched his teeth with hostility and looked at the stands, saying displeasedly for them to just look at these idiots. He angrily asked the question, why do even those serving in the army even call a 17-year-old girl that? A girl with long blue hair stood in front of him. A voice announced that it was the final of the ranking matches. Kim Ju-hyuk stood still, not expressing any concern. He looked forward as if trying to see something. Once again, someone's voice announced that Kim Ju-hyuk is fighting against Choi Aaron. Choi Aaron swung what was in her hands. She was the second daughter of the Choijin family. Someone's voice announced that they should begin the battle. Choi Aaron began to swing the sheathed sword that was in her hands. She looked at the calm Kim Ju-hyuk standing in front of her with an attentive and tenacious gaze. Choi Aaron frowned as she looked ahead carefully. She held the hilt of the sword tightly. Kim Ju-hyuk looked at her with the same attentive gaze, smiling slightly. He did not stand in any fighting position, but only quietly waited for the first actions of the battle from her. Choi Aaron, meanwhile, was still in a side attack stance. She held the scabbard in her hands, looking forward at him. Kim Ju-hyuk mentally asked the question, what? He guessed, asking again, was she waiting for him to attack? He looked at her carefully and thought, since at least she is trying to read the situation, then at least she will be better than all the previous ones. Choi Aaron still continued to stand in place in an expectant stance. Kim Ju-hyuk grinned, showing his snow-white teeth, and wondered if he should. He began to quickly walk towards Choi Aaron, who was still standing in place. A contemptuous grin appeared on his face. He continued to walk forward smugly, with his hands in his pockets. Choi Aaron tightened her grip on the sword in her hands, moving it slightly. Next to the handle of this, huge stripes of bright blue and white energy began to appear, which completely enveloped the entire atmosphere. The girl standing in the stands filming this asked the question, has she already mastered the ability to change the elements of the Jeongjin family at the age of 17? She asked, stunned. What is this glow? Another guy exclaimed in surprise that all the children from the 5 families this time were simply incredible. Choi Aaron, meanwhile, tensely put her sword forward, looking at Kim Ju-hyuk approaching her. The aura next to her began to spread in all directions, making a strange sound. Kim Ju-hyuk took another step forward. Choi Aaron frowned and thought, what now? She swung her sword sharply, trying to hit Kim Ju-hyuk on the chest. From her blow, an aura began to spread in all directions. Choi Aaron began to quickly run forward, jumping slightly. She pulled out a sword from its sheath, from which a bright aura emanated. Suddenly, she looked around in a daze, not noticing Kim Ju-hyuk. She made a questioning sound, looking around carefully. Kim Ju-hyuk, meanwhile, called out to her threateningly and asked her a question. If she is going to tell with her eyes where she is going to attack, then isn't it too easy to dodge his attack? Choi Aaron froze in place, in a confused state. On one side of her stood Kim Ju-hyuk, who looked at her with undisguised mischief. Choi Aaron looked at him sideways and said that. Kim Ju-hyuk struck her in the chest with a sharp movement, pushing her back. From his strong blow, a red aura began to spread. Choi Aaron screamed in complaint, feeling intense pain. Kim Ju-hyuk looked at her carefully, making a sound of surprise. Choi Aaron's sword began to move forward with a sharp movement. Suddenly, Choi Aaron's hand began to shake, causing her to wrap both hands around the sword from opposite sides. Choi Aaron began to slide backwards, drawing a long path of strong attack energy. Kim Ju-hyuk looked at her and thought that this was how she managed to dodge the blow thanks to the blade. He clenched his fist and thought, it's no wonder he didn't feel the sensation when he hit it. Choi Aaron looked down with tears in her eyes and, continuing to shake her whole body, thought that she was having a hard time. Suddenly, she noticed someone's fist leaning against the blade of her sword. Kim Joo-hyuk leaned his fist against the blade, looking intently at Choi Erin, who looked up at him, stunned. She clenched the palm in which she held the blade and continued to look forward. Kim Joo-hyuk moved his fist away from the sword and said that now let her try to dodge this. He grinned, looking at her mischievously. With a sharp movement, he pushed her in the chest. Choi Erin lost her balance and began to fly backwards. From Kim Joo-hyuk's blow, long yellow waves of his aura began to spread everywhere. Choi Erin pressed the blades to her chest in fear, her mouth open in shock. Kim Joo-hyuk watched as she flipped in the air and landed on her back with all her might, hitting her head. He looked thoughtfully, still clenching his fist, and thought it was an attack. He looked at Choi Erin's unconscious body and asked the question, was it his imagination, or was something definitely wrong? He added that his posture was slightly crooked upon impact. Kim Joo-hyuk turned sharply, starting to walk away, and thought that he didn't really care. Suddenly, a voice announced that the winner was Kim Joo-hyuk. A ranking of the best players in Valhalla was written on the display board. In first place was Kim Joo-hyuk, and in second place was Choi Erin, whom he recently fought. In third place is Jang Juan. All other places were poorly visible. In 8th place was Lee Chang-gon, in 9th place was Oh Si-hyuk, and in 10th place was Kim Yeon-won. Kim Joo-hyuk looked carefully at his initials written on the board. Everything seemed to float before his eyes. After some time, he walked among the houses, starting to stretch his neck. Suddenly, Kim Joo-hyuk froze, noticing microphones, phones, and voice recorders in front of him. He asked a question, being in a shocked state, "What is this?" Meanwhile, people approached him, asking him to tell them a story. Someone asked him to listen to them. The reporters' voices asked questions that all blurred together. Someone asked him again, shouting for him to join Chonmyeon. Someone else shouted loudly that their guild has maintained its reputation for 30 years. The reporter, holding a notepad and pen, shouted if he joined them, they would give him the best move. They continued to place voice recorders and microphones forward closer to Kim Joo-hyuk. Whose voice was it that again asked him to join their guild? Someone cut him off abruptly, shouting that their guild was better. The same voice added that it had a 30-year history. Kim Joo-hyuk gritted his teeth angrily after looking at this and said to all of them. He screamed very loudly for them all to get away from him. On the front page of the news feed was a photo of Kim Joo-hyuk, eyes white with rage, making obscene gestures with both hands to reporters and journalists. A headline is written above the photo. The journalist asks the question, is Kim Joo-hyuk a sick psychopath? Is it true that after winning the competition for admission, maddened with anger, he showed obscene gestures right and left towards the guilds, making him offers to join? This news received 92 comments from readers. One of them, under the nickname Otterak, wrote that it was a shame. It was also filmed. It was funny to watch him lose his temper and then shout obscenities to get them to leave him alone. Another, under the nickname Soft Cake, wrote a comment that, frankly, seeing how he swore at them, he begins to doubt that he is an adequate person. Many users supported these comments, expressing their agreement. A user under the nickname Uncomfortable wrote, even if he does not belong to any class, no matter how angry he is, swearing like this is already too much. And even in a public place. He indignantly asked what kind of children have come to this day. Several users wrote comments saying that it was very rude for a newbie. A reader under the nickname I Love Aaron Nunu asked the question, why on earth did that idiot Kim Joo-hyuk suddenly start insulting the scouts? If he ended up in Valhalla, he would probably become a hunter, just like them. So what's the point in ruining his relationship with them? One of the readers wrote that after he killed 5 families, he would be accepted anywhere, even with such a bad character. He was stunned to see Kim Joo-hyuk beat up Aaron Nuna and Yoo Se-in, who is not even worth mentioning. He forgot that she even existed, considering that Yoo Se-in could not even reach the finals. User Fisheye wrote, in any case, cursing someone is very bad. He is a petty freak. After a while, Valhalla. Kim Joo-hyuk and many other applicants stood in the bright hall. They were dressed in identical dark blue uniforms, white shirts, and gray vests. Someone said they were welcoming freshmen to Valhalla, which boasts 100 years of history. Kim Joo-hyuk yawned out of boredom, covering his mouth with his hand. He thought it was very boring. Suddenly he felt that the guy standing next to him was looking at him. Kim Joo-hyuk sighed displeasedly. He turned his head and looked at this guy. The guy turned away in fear. Kim Joo-hyuk mentally asked himself, did he really stand out yesterday? He remembered why he was there. He needs to return his weapons and memories, which are located on the 3rd floor in the 5th room of Valhalla. He mentally asked himself, find his weapons and memories? Valhalla, Constellation Room. After a while, he thought that he just needed to get in and get out. This shouldn't be a problem. Besides, he now realized something. He stood in front of the Valhalla building, and a voice said that this was the end of the welcoming ceremony. Opposite one of the doors was a sign that said that this was a virtual combat simulation class. Kim Ligong, the former head of the Choijin family's Valhalla instructors, looked ahead and asked with excitement, why were the applicants distributed this way? In the first line is Yu Soyin from the Yushin family. Next to her is Aaron from the Choijin family. He then looked at O.C. Hayek, who crossed his arms over his chest with a dissatisfied expression on his face. A black aura emanated from him. Kim Ligun thought displeasedly, this thug in the very center is Oh Seok from the Osun family. He grabbed his head in a panic and thought, they had said that the students would be randomly assigned to classes. Kim Ligong mentally asked, how could 3 geniuses end up in the same class at once? Suddenly he looked to the side with alarm and began to sweat. He looked at Kim Joo-hyuk, who in turn looked at him with interest. Kim Ligong anxiously asked himself, why is this freak here too? This year he is simply doomed. He decided that he should calm down. In such a situation, you need to stay strong. Kim Ligon tried to regain his composure, brought his fist to his mouth and cleared his throat. He said loudly that he was glad to see them. He is in charge of their class as well as their personal instructor. His name is Kim Ligon. He stood behind the podium, looking at the students. Behind his back hung a sword in a sheath. Kim Ligon pressed the button with his index finger and said with a sly expression that this is a start. The floor under the students' feet glowed brightly with white light. They screamed in fear, what is this? What's happening? A moment later, they all found themselves on the street. In front of them stood a podium, behind which was their instructor Kim Ligon. Students excitedly asked questions. What is this? Where are they? Kim Joo-hyuk silently looked around, studying the situation. One of the students shouted out excitedly. They had just been in the room. Kim Ligong reached out with his hand to touch the hilt of his sword. Grasping it tightly, he decided he would show a little bloodlust. Suddenly, from one side, a crowd of goblins armed with clubs rushed towards them. Their auras glowed bright red. On the other hand, orcs began to approach them, growling angrily. They looked menacingly at the students with their red eyes. A moment later, monsters surrounded the students on all sides, who looked at them in fear. Oh Sehek, crossing his arms over his chest, thought that these were orcs and goblins. He can rate them at least 100. One of the monsters growled menacingly, drool flowing from its toothy mouth. The monsters rushed into battle. One of them extended a gray-clawed hand to Oh Sehek's face. The monster's hand glowed with a white magical glow. Oh Seyuk looked at this excitedly. He instantly created a protective transparent barrier around himself, through which the monsters could not reach him. They scratched the barrier with their claws, pounded on it with their fists, tried to jump over, but to no avail. Kim Ligong smiled approvingly and thought it was great. The barrier works great. The angry monsters hit the barrier with their clubs and hit it with their bodies. The students watched them in fear, hiding inside the barrier. Someone called Kim Joo-hyuk by name. He turned his head to the side in surprise and asked what. Someone told him to come there. Kim Joo-hyuk walked up to instructor Kim Ligun and stood opposite him on the other side of the podium. He pointed his thumb towards the monsters and asked the question, "Can he handle them alone?" Kim Joo-hyuk clarified by asking the question, "Is he now referring to those who are running around behind the dome?" Kim Ligun answered yes. Kim Joo-hyuk thought about it. Kim Ligong smiled smugly and thought it was wonderful. His ego must have diminished a little. Most students have only seen real monsters in books, but have never met them in person. So it's only natural that he's scared right now. Kim Ligun looked at him mockingly and thought, Let him stop pretending to be thoughtful and just answer no. As soon as he pacifies his pride, the lesson will immediately begin. Kim Joo-hyuk smiled cheerfully, showing white teeth. Kim Ligong got angry and mentally asked a question. Is he laughing now? His aura turned fiery red. Kim Ligun asked a question, looking at how he chuckled. Did he believe that he could deal with them on his own and without outside help? Kim Joo-hyuk answered confidently, no problem. Kim Ligong thought irritably that this guy was still bluffing. He said out loud, well then, let him try. Kim Joo-hyuk put his hands in his trouser pockets and brazenly asked the question, should he do this just like that? Kim Ligong asked in bewilderment what? Kim Joo-hyuk said with a smug grin. From what he heard, they shouldn't be doing something like that on their first day of training. Seeing how persistently he tries to test him, he dares to assume that there is some kind of reward for this. He brazenly asked the question, isn't that so? Kim Ligun frowned with displeasure and said that there was no prize in the condition. Kim Joo-hyuk said that they can talk about it now. With a sly expression on his face, he asked what he was willing to bet on. That he can't handle these monsters? Kim Ligun thought for a moment, then said, if he deals with them, he will do everything for him that is within his authority. Kim Joo-hyuk smiled in anticipation and thought, touching his chin with his fingers. After thinking, he said, even if it sounded rather regrettable, he agreed. Kim Ligun said he thinks he doesn't realize that the monsters in this system are no different from the real ones. Kim Joo-hyuk impatiently extended his hand forward and said, just let him give him the sword. Kim Ligun asked in surprise, sword? Kim Joo-hyuk indignantly asked how he would fight without a weapon. Or did the instructor really expect him to fight them with his bare hands? Kim Joo-hyuk looked at the evil monsters, who opened their predatory mouths, showing off their fangs. Kim Ligun sighed thoughtfully and reached for his sword. He held out the sword and said let him take it. Kim Joo-hyuk looked joyfully at the sword and began to slowly take it out of its sheath. In front of Kim Joo-hyuk, the barrier moved apart and a passage appeared. The monsters greeted him outside the barrier with delighted grins. Kim Ligun watched what was happening in disbelief. Yuseon and Choi Aaron looked after him with excitement. Kim Joo-hyuk abruptly pulled out a sharp sword from its sheath and swung it with a predatory glint in his eyes, cutting down many goblins. Their scarlet blood flooded everything around. Kim Joo-hyuk warily examined the situation with his eyes, holding his sword ready in front of him. His look is full of determination and courage. As several goblins approached him, he swung his sword from side to side and easily cut through their bodies. Kim Joo-hyuk heard an angry growl behind him. Several orcs were approaching him, swinging huge clubs. Their eyes sparkled with red fire. Kim Joo-hyuk sharply turned the blade in the air, pointing the tip back. He turned, looked to the side, and forcefully plunged his sword into the neck of one orc. Purple blood gushed out. Kim Joo-hyuk clearly enjoyed the fight. His eyes glowed with a predatory fire. He selflessly waved his sword in different directions, hitting monsters, and thought that 300 years had passed since he held the sword in his hands, and it was still quite good. In those days, the world was in complete chaos because of monsters, and they used any means at hand as a weapon. Kim Joo-hyuk remembered how, as a teenager, he fought monsters with a shovel, and pickaxe. But the sword had always been something special to him. Kim Joo-hyuk heard something behind him and looked around warily. Behind him stood a huge, powerful, tall orc holding a club in his hand. Kim Joo-hyuk stepped to the side and easily dodged the strong blow that the monster tried to hit him with. His club hit the ground with a loud crash. Kim Joo-hyuk smiled smugly and thought that their pattern of behavior was quite simple, as he expected. He swung his sword, hit the monster in the head, and thought that it was just a high-quality fake. The students watched with excitement as he easily dispatched the terrible monsters. Instructor Kim Ligong opened his mouth in shock and thought it was incredible. He just lent him his sword. He watched Kim Joo-hyuk with interest and noted that there was no magic or any effort in him. He asked in bewilderment how he could cut something so easily. It's as if this sword itself attracts monsters to itself. At this time, the monsters tried to surround Kim Joo-hyuk, but he swung his sword with a mischievous smile and cut their bodies all in one fell swoop. Choi Erin wrapped her arms around herself in excitement and watched the battle with anxiety. Oh Sehek looked ahead intensely and said that this was crazy. At this time, Kim Joo-hyuk stood on a pile of monster corpses and struck a large green monster, which began to fall back defeated. Choi Erin clenched her fist and pressed it to her chest, keeping an eye on the fight. At this time, Kim Joo-hyuk sheathed his sword and said that he wanted to go down to the Constellation room. He stood calmly and confidently, towering over the many defeated monsters lying on the ground. Behind him, several dying goblins let out pitiful groans. With a sly expression on his face, Kim Joo-hyuk looked over his shoulder at instructor Kim Ligun and asked the question, "He will fulfill his promise, right?" Kim Ligun, still under the impression, looked at him from under his brows with excitement and remained silent. The sky above Valhalla turned into bright sunset colors. The building itself, reflecting the sunset sky, acquired a pink tint. Kim Ligun, standing behind the podium, said that that's all for today. It must have been quite tiring. Since this is their first lesson, let them go to their rooms and get some rest. The students silently rose from their chairs, pushing them under their tables. Kim Joo-hyuk tiredly leaned back in his chair and did not move. He was very tired and mentally asked, what kind of lesson is this if it lasts so long? He decided that he would just take what he needed and get out of here as quickly as possible. Closing his eyes from fatigue, he plunged into his thoughts. He never thought about teaching anyone, and he never went to school. After a while, the students walked silently down the street, looking at the beautiful sunset sky. Everyone had backpacks on their backs. Kim Joo-hyuk walked behind everyone and thought that even though the lesson was boring, he got some information from this. For example, a story related to one of the constellations. In his past life, there was no such thing as a constellation. Let's talk about the meaning of this word. Constellation is a term used to describe the transformation of those who have previously experienced great concentrations of luck into gods. In the darkness stood the silhouette of a large, muscular man, whose aura and eyes glowed with golden light. Behind him was a circle glowing with a golden glow, in which many symbols were written and drawn. Most constellations are connected to hunters through sacred relics, which give them special powers. A blond man in a dark, formal suit bowed his head in reverence before the deity. The deity silently handed him a sword glowing with a golden aura on her palms. Valhalla in Korea is the third largest academy in the world, which houses a huge number of their reliquaries. Kim Joo-hyuk walked down the street with his hands in his pockets and lost in his thoughts. He thought something like this. Everything else about fencing and monster-killing tactics is nonsense. He should go to the dorm and take up martial arts seriously. His body is too weak. Kim Joo-hyuk winced in pain and began to knead his shoulder with his hand. Suddenly, he heard someone's voice behind him. Kim Joo-hyuk asked in surprise, "What?" He looked back with interest and saw Choi Erin standing modestly behind him. Out of uncertainty, she clasped her palms together in front of her and silently looked at him. Over time, there was a sign above the gray door that said this was the teacher's office. Lee Sang-chul held a coffee glass in his hand and said, "Well, he got it." Kim Ligun sat sadly in a chair with his hands folded in his lap. He said, "To be honest, it's more ridiculous than hard." Lee Sang-chul leaned his back against the wall and took a sip from his glass. Kim Ligun looked at him worriedly and said, "No, it just doesn't make sense." He questioned doubtfully, "Is Kim Joo-hyuk really a high school student?" This time, in a virtual battle simulation room, with the help of inspiration, he created about 120 monsters. Lee Sang-chul frowned thoughtfully and asked the question, "Did he just kill them all?" A high school student who has never encountered a monster before. Kim Ligong sweated with excitement and said sadly, "This is what he is trying to say." Lee Sang-chul sighed thoughtfully. He looked ahead intensely and said, "Based on what he knows about him, there is nothing special about him. This is even stranger." Kim Ligong asked excitedly, "Did he have any remarkable stories in his past either?" Lee Sang-chul confirmed this and said that this guy is an orphan. He came from a small orphanage in a very dangerous area. Kim Ligun asked in disbelief, "Is he an orphan? Maybe he's just a forger." Lee Sang-chul raised the coffee glass to his mouth and thoughtfully said that he had conducted his own little investigation. which confirmed all the available information. So he's definitely not lying. Besides, he thinks how stupid it would be for a forger to enter Valhalla and cause such a commotion at the entrance ceremony. He remembered how rudely Kim Joo-hyuk behaved in front of reporters, showing obscene gestures and swearing. Kim Ligon sighed thoughtfully and said, "Indeed." Lee Sang-chul looked at him and asked a question. Besides, he said that Kim Joo-hyuk asked him for access to the Constellation room, right? Kim Ligong sighed sadly and confirmed it. Lee Sang-chul, holding a coffee glass in front of him, said that after the end of the first semester, he would have been able to get there without someone else's permission. If he asks the director, he will probably allow him to go down there. Kim Ligong sadly lowered his head, looked down and said that he was very grateful for this. Lee Sang-chul raised the coffee glass to his mouth, closed his eyes, and took a sip with pleasure. He then said that he was the one who brought Kim Ligon here. He has no less responsibility. Lowering his hand with the coffee glass down, Lee Sang-chul leaned sideways against the coffee machine and said, he doesn't know what it is about the completely closed area on the 5th floor, but anyone can get to the 1st floor. So there won't be any problems if he gets there a little earlier than expected. Kim Ligong sadly lowered his head and said yes. Behind him, through the window glass, one could see the bright orange sunset sky and the leaves of the tree, which turned red-orange. Kim Ligun excitedly admitted that he was a little worried about what awaits them next year. Lee Sang-chul asked in surprise why. Is it because of Kim Joo-hyuk? Kim Ligun said, and because of him too. He knows that besides him in his class, there are 3 students from famous families. It is not so easy to control each of them. Lee Sang-chul crossed his arms, holding a coffee glass in one of them, and replied that he understood. He took a few steps forward and said that he was not trying to console him, but an exchange student from the Ventric family was assigned to another class. Kim Ligun opened his mouth worriedly and asked a question. Does he say Ventric? He asked with excitement. Are they the same Ventric? Lee Sang-chul mentally imagined a blonde-haired youth with a sly expression on his face and said, yes, he is directly from the Ventric family. Rockdale Ventric. Kim Ligun sweated with excitement and thought, Rockdale Ventric. He heard about how he was kicked out of the British Academy because of some mischief. He closed his eyes and sighed with relief. Kim Ligun said now he's starting to feel like things aren't so bad. Lee Sang-chul stood in the middle of the teacher's room and said, exactly. At the same time, against the backdrop of the sunset sky, Kim Joo-hyuk looked back in surprise. He looked at Choi Aaron, who looked at him with a sad look. Kim Joo-hyuk asked the question, what's the matter? She looked down embarrassedly and said quietly, let him teach her. She looked into his eyes and said louder, let him teach her fencing. Kim Joo-hyuk looked at her in surprise. He turned sharply to the side at someone's voice. This voice asked him to teach her. Kim Joo-hyuk turned to the side, noticing Choi Aaron in front of him. She said, repeating again that he should teach her fencing. She held a case with some object behind her and looked at it carefully. Kim Joo-hyuk exhaled in annoyance without saying anything. He froze in place. Choi Aaron said at this time that the skill he demonstrated then. She added more confidently that he should teach her this. Kim Joo-hyuk began scratching his ear with his finger in confusion and said no. He continued to stand there, looking bored, with one hand in his pocket. Choi Aaron dissatisfiedly asked the question, why? Kim Joo-hyuk asked a question in response. Why is she asking? He replied that he simply did not want to do it. He turned away from her, looking forward. Choi Aaron continued to follow him with her gaze. Kim Joo-hyuk immediately turned his head sharply in her direction and asked a question. Does she have anything else to say? He added in a firm voice that he would then leave. Choi Aaron repeated more firmly, looking at him to teach her fencing. Kim Joo-hyuk looked at her in confusion, his eyes wide open. He said nothing. A moment later he repeated, he had already said that he did not want to. Kim Joo-hyuk sarcastically asked her, has she cleaned her ears lately? He repeated in the same firmer voice so that she would stop pestering him. Kim Joo-hyuk pointed his finger at her, raised his hand, and said that he had no desire to teach her. He added, so let her leave him alone. He began to move forward, closer to the sunset sky. Choi Aaron looked at him. She didn't answer him anymore. Her eyes slightly expressed sadness and thoughtfulness. After some time, morning came. The bright sun illuminated the roofs of white buildings. Kim Joo-hyuk sat at his desk with his legs spread relaxed. Meanwhile, other students continued to sit on their desks next to him. Kim Joo-hyuk sat and looked down thoughtfully. Suddenly, he heard a sound. He raised his hand sharply and looked carefully at his palm. Kim Joo-hyuk thought he expected something like this. He added, with a slight curl of his lips, that this body was better than he had previously believed. He began to bend his fingers slightly. Kim Joo-hyuk began to think further, but he cannot train in martial arts anymore, so nothing else. He mentally concluded that this is all because he does not have any magical abilities. On top of that, it is quite difficult for him to control his flow of mana. Kim Joo-hyuk immediately clenched his hand angrily and thought that the problem with magic could be solved if he found this thing. He began to think further. He should stock up on some mana. Suddenly, someone called his name. A guy approached him, putting his hands in his pants pockets. Kim Joo-hyuk looked up at him in surprise, exhaling slightly questioningly. In front of him stood a guy with blonde hair who took on an arrogant pose. Behind him stood a blonde girl who sadly clasped her hands and lowered her gaze. The guy was from the main line of the Ventric family. His name was Rockdale Ventric. Behind him stood a girl who was his maid. Her name was Yuria de Felix. Rockdale Ventric almost came close to the desk where Kim Joo-hyuk was sitting. Kim Joo-hyuk asked him a question, looking at him with a cool gaze. Who else is he? Rockdale Ventric began to think intensely that this was what was to be expected from an ignorant guy. He frowned, continuing to look down, and began to think further that he did not even know their family. Rockdale Ventric immediately proudly said that standing in front of him was Rockdale from the Ventric family. Kim Joo-hyuk continued to look at him without any emotion. Rockdale Ventric immediately added that he would ask directly. He extended his hand with a sinister grin and asked the question, "Doesn't he want to become stronger?" His eyes seemed to glow a bright yellow, like those of a predator. The main line of the Ventric family was Rockdale Ventric. In most families, it is much more difficult for people from the secondary family branch to achieve power and recognition than those who belong to the main one. The main line of the family was one level higher than the side line of the family. However, the Ventric family possessed a beaked mask from a relic of one of the constellations. This is what distinguished this family from others. In an ordinary constellation of the highest class or higher, there is a guardian, who is the direct protector of the family. They are the ones who choose the text, who will become the constellation and grant them the necessary strength and protection. The Ventric family decided to enter into a contract directly with a member of their family who was not yet the chosen constellation. This was the only way for the chosen person to enter into a contract with the constellation without any disagreement. Thanks to this decision, the Ventric family began to have the greatest influence in Europe. If a person is a member of the Ventric family, then he can choose any person to enter into a contract, regardless of his origin. That is why even the subsidiary branches of the Ventric family had the same power that the main ones had. Rockdale Ventric, who belonged to this family, was expected and even too arrogant. Not long ago, due to turmoil in the British Academy, he was expelled. Rockdale Ventric was sent outside the academy without any regrets, closing the iron doors. Rockdale Ventric thought everything was fine. He added tensely that there was no point in crying over this. Suddenly, he heard strange sounds behind him and turned his head sharply with a wary smile. Behind him stood a girl. Rockdale Ventric grinned and, looking in her direction, mentally decided that he always gets what he wants anyway. He decided that even if he was expelled, Rockdale Ventric began to think further. Considering the family he came from, they would always find a way to bring him back. He grinned, looking ahead with a grin. Rockdale Ventric remembered someone's outline and mentally assumed that this should suit him. He closed his eyes, starting to think, and thought what to start with. Rockdale Ventric, meanwhile, stood over Kim Joo-hyuk and thought that the beast would be his, which attracted attention at the welcoming ceremony. He arrogantly said, if he obeys him, he will lead him to the constellation of the Ventric family. Kim Joo-hyuk rolled his eyes and asked the question, is he an idiot? Rockdale Ventric opened his eyes in shock, not expecting to hear such a thing. Yuria de Felix still looked down thoughtfully and sadly, squeezing her lips tightly. Rockdil Ventric leaned his hand on the desk and indignantly asked the question, "What did he just say?" Kim Ju Hyuk mockingly asked him a question. Does he probably think he is stupid? He said that he was not at all interested in him, and he had just been bragging since his appearance. Kim Ju Hyuk answered him threateningly and admitted that if he started making such a speech, then he was an absolute moron. He asked the question, "Isn't that so?" Rockdil Ventric clenched his teeth angrily, looked forward furiously, and said that he also shouted that these are ignorant, dirty things. Suddenly, someone behind them loudly called for them to return to their place. The same voice spoke again to Rockdil Ventric, who cried out in fear. Kim Ju Hyuk looked back in surprise. Meanwhile, Rockdil Ventric began to shout angrily. He asked the question, did he just decide to tell him? Lee Sangshil crossed his arms over his chest and frowned forward at the indignant Rockdil Ventric. Lee Sangshil said that this was not the British Academy, but Valhalla. He explained that no matter how powerful the Ventric family is, he must obey their instructors. Rockdil Ventric thoughtfully froze in place and mentally asked the question, is this Lee Sangshil, who was the combat instructor of Valhalla? Rockdil Ventric clenched his teeth tighter, beginning to grind them loudly. He turned around angrily, starting to walk away from Kim Ju Hyuk. Rockdil Ventric roughly led Yuri de Felix behind him. He began to open the door, which hit the wall with a loud knock, and said that they would meet again soon. Kim Ju Hyuk looked at him in surprise without answering. Sometime later, it gradually began to get dark outside. The setting sun illuminated the park with bright colors, along which Kim Ju Hyuk and other students walked. Kim Ju Hyuk thought that he didn't learn anything new today. He added that there was no useful information about the Constellation Room. Instead, he had to deal with some idiot this morning. Kim Ju Hyuk pressed his hand to his forehead and said, he now knows that the scouts from the guild were outsiders who were constantly near the school. He began to think further that they even used teachers and students to figure out where he was. Meanwhile, Choi Aaron walked like a shadow behind him. Kim Ju Hyuk did not notice her and mentally asked the question, was it too much of him to insult them like that? Choi Aaron tried to call him, making a strange sound. Kim Ju Hyuk turned sharply in her direction, stunned and frozen in place. Choi Aaron again asked him to teach her fencing. Kim Ju Hyuk froze doomedly in place, looking at her with a frown. He asked her a question. Was yesterday not enough for her? Sometime later in the Valhalla dorm, in a top classroom. The windows were bordered with beautiful engraved mullion surrounds. Above the cabinet hung paintings placed in portraits with glass. A huge circular lamp stood next to the chair. Someone, cursing several times, hit the lamp with all his might, breaking it into small pieces. Rockdil Ventric clenched his fists angrily, standing next to the chair. Yuria de Felix stood a little further away from him, her hands folded quietly. Rockdil Ventric gritted his teeth angrily as he introduced Kim Ju Hyuk. He mentally turned to him and asked a question. Does an insignificant orphan like him dare to humiliate him? Rockdil Ventric told Yuria de Felix to contact Disser. He added that he needed him to deal with someone. He looked at the broken pieces of the lamp, which brightly reflected the sun's rays. He continued to clench his fist tightly, clenching his teeth tightly. Yuria de Felix continued to stand in place. Rockdil Ventric turned in her direction and addressed her by name in a threatening voice. Yuria de Felix remained silent, looking down. Suddenly, Rockdil Ventric suddenly grabbed her by the hair, squeezing her head tightly. Yuria de Felix screamed desperately as she felt intense pain. Rockdil Ventric pulled her head up and shouted at her to answer when he asked. Yuria de Felix frowned deeply in pain, looking at him to the side. Rockdil Ventric asked angrily, does she still feel like the eldest daughter of the palace family? He gripped her hair tighter and asked again, should he throw her out of their family then? Yuria de Felix looked down desperately and in panic. She said in a trembling voice that no. Rockdil Ventric threw her to the floor with all his might. Yuria de Felix hit the floor with her entire body. Rockdil Ventric looked at her with hostility and said again that she should contact Disser. He added that he needed him to deal with someone. Rockdil Ventric continued to say that she should tell the son of the Rise family, who was in the 2nd grade, That Ventric wants to see him. Yuria de Felix did not look up and continued to look down. She obediently replied that she understood. Meanwhile, in the Valhalla dorm, in Kim Joo-hyuk's room. Kim Joo-hyuk sat in the room, placed in darkness. A bright blue aura rose up from his entire body. Moonlight streamed in from the windows, slightly illuminating the edge of the bed. Kim Joo-hyuk closed his eyes, trying to meditate. Bright blue stripes, similar to blue flames, began to emanate more and more from him in different directions. Kim Joo-hyuk completely relaxed his entire body, concentrating on his energy. He suddenly exhaled forcefully. Drops of sweat began to run down his face from fatigue. Kim Joo-hyuk began to breathe heavily, clutching his heart, and thought that this body was just terrible somehow. He said he couldn't even extract a particle of magic. Kim Joo-hyuk looked down thoughtfully, her lips pursed tightly. Sometime later, he walked down the street again, putting his hands in his pockets. Behind him, Choi Erin walked with small, quiet steps. Kim Joo-hyuk noticed that she was following him. He looked forward with difficulty. Suddenly, he stopped abruptly. Choi Erin repeated after him, slowing down on high-heeled shoes. Kim Joo-hyuk turned to her and irritably asked the question, "What else?" He noticed that they were already right in front of the dorm. He asked her a question, how long was she going to follow him? Choi Erin again firmly repeated that he should teach her the art of fencing. Kim Joo-hyuk angrily asked her a question with a slight chuckle, "Is she a parrot?" Kim Joo-hyuk began to think further that she was already pissing him off very much. He decided that he needed to get rid of her. Kim Joo-hyuk told her that she was charged 10 million won. Choi Erin opened her mouth. Kim Joo-hyuk, meanwhile, repeated that the cost of one lesson was 10 million won. Choi Erin froze in place. She looked down desperately without answering. Kim Joo-hyuk began to turn his back to her and asked her a question, "Can she not afford this?" He said that then he would go. Choi Erin, meanwhile, subtly told him to give her his phone number. Kim Joo-hyuk exhaled in surprise, having many questions in his head. He began to hold out the phone. Choi Erin immediately snatched it from his hands. Kim Joo-hyuk asked her a question, "Why does he need his phone?" Choi Erin replied that then she would enter her phone number into it. Kim Joo-hyuk froze in place, watching her fingers, pressing something on the phone screen. Choi Erin said with a smile, handing the phone back, that this would make it much easier for her to transfer money to him. In her other hand, she was holding her phone with a pink case. Kim Joo-hyuk asked in surprise, taking the phone back, "What?" He looked down, puzzled. Kim Joo-hyuk mentally asked a question after seeing the notification, 100 million won. Choi Erin put her phone to her lips and asked him a question with hope in her eyes. Now will he teach her? Kim Joo-hyuk also awkwardly put out his phone and answered with a sly smile that he didn't. Meanwhile, a voice on the phone said that he had rejected the transfer. Sometime later, Kim Joo-hyuk sat on the bed again and thought about how he was stunned at that moment. He wondered in his mind, how could a simple student send 100 million won at once? Kim Joo-hyuk thoughtfully put his hand to his chin and thought that if he began to teach her, he would have to spill all his secrets. He realized that this amount of money. Kim Joo-hyuk abruptly stopped himself from thinking and thought that it didn't matter anymore. He began to get out of bed and thought that it was just money that had no value for him. He thought all he had to do was find it. He mentally added, even if he had such a terrible amount of mana. Kim Joo-hyuk wore a sweater with blue and black sleeves and later pulled on gray sneakers. He stood in place, putting the necessary instruments in his backpack, and thought that he was starting to act. Kim Joo-hyuk in his thoughts, he decided that he needed to find a secret vault. Sometime later at the stadium, which stood next to a tall building, Kim Joo-hyuk walked through the forest with his hood pulled up. He thought, grabbing the straps of his backpack, that before entering this school, he checked this in advance. He went on to argue that, however, most of the records hidden 300 years ago were destroyed. He stepped on one of the cobblestones to step over this one, and thought, according to his investigation, by today he should have at least 4 records left. Kim Joo-hyuk mentally suggested that most likely there were only 3 of them left. He looked forward exhaustedly, exhaling heavily, which is the most important thing. He looked at the mountains that were next to the building, that they were all hidden in the mountains of Valhalla. Kim Joo-hyuk decided that he needed to find it. He put his hands forward, beginning to control his aura, which gradually spread from his feet to the ground. The aura began to make deep cracks in the ground, spreading over long distances. Kim Joo-hyuk closed his eyes and thought that the location of the recording could be determined by feeling the marble. He reasoned further that with the small amount of magic that was currently focused on his work, he could still sense the location of the first entry. Kim Joo-hyuk continued to meditate. After some time, a bright circle of blue aura lit up in the middle of the forest. Kim Joo-hyuk opened his eyes and said with anticipation that he had found it. He looked at the bright shining circle in the middle of the forest, from which blue rays emanated in all directions. After some time, Kim Joo-hyuk began to dig the ground with a shovel, from where a bright light was breaking through. He began to exhale heavily as he continued to dig at it. Kim Joo-hyuk mentally said what a terrible and weak body this is. After some time, he dug a deep hole with a shovel, throwing the dug-out part of the earth to the side. Kim Joo-hyuk mentally thought, if only he knew it would be so hard for him. He thought angrily, then he buried it in a simpler place. Kim Joo-hyuk looked in surprise and said, continuing to exhale heavily, if the tower had not been destroyed 300 years ago, then there would be no need to do something like that. He stuck the shovel into the ground again with all his might. Kim Joo-hyuk began to think further that the world was on the verge of destruction, and there was no room left for his wealth. That is why he decided to leave the notes here. After some more time, Kim Joo-hyuk asked the question, was everything inside intact and preserved? He really hoped so. Small particles of earth continued to fly off in all directions. After some time, the sun began to rise from behind the mountains of Valhalla. Kim Joo-hyuk stood at the very depths of the pit, tiredly rubbing his forehead with his fist. He continued to exhale heavily. A bright blue light spread from below, illuminating half of his body. Kim Joo-hyuk said that he finally found it. He looked at the huge iron hatch and said that this was his recording. Kim Joo-hyuk asked, puzzled, where the keyholes were. He began to brush off the dust on the door with his hands, unearthing the keyhole. Kim Joo-hyuk suddenly said joyfully that this is it. He pressed his thumb against the end of the keyhole. Kim Joo-hyuk knew that an ordinary key would not work here. He brought his hands slightly closer to each other, starting to create it from his aura. He was going to create a logical thread. A circle of blue color appeared next to his palms, which brightly illuminated his palm. After some time, a key appeared in his hands, wrapped in white threads. Kim Joo-hyuk thus formed a key from this. He inserted it into the keyhole, starting to turn it with a loud sound. Kim Joo-hyuk grinned and mentally thought that this was great, because the key fit. Meanwhile, a lot of things were lying in a heap below. After some time, the hatch gradually began to open, allowing the sun's rays to pass through. This began to brightly illuminate the many coins scattered below. Kim Joo-hyuk began to jump out of the hatch with a sharp movement and said that it was good. He jumped down right in front of the huge mountains of gold, placing his hand on the floor. Kim Joo-hyuk grinned, looking ahead smugly. He asked the question, seeing in front of him a lot of coins, weapons, and chests. Did his children lie well here? Kim Joo-hyuk rests his hands on his sides and examines the gold, shimmering under the sunlight penetrating into his hiding place. A smile appears on his face, and he realizes that now that he doesn't have to worry about money, he can finally start looking for this thing. But the next moment he freezes, seeing something ahead, and even says in surprise, "What? These are storage stones." Among the yellow coins there were indeed several minerals, shimmering with purple and blue colors. They looked as if an entire cosmos was contained inside them. Bending down and picking up one of the stones, Joo-hyuk made a mental note to keep his notes. He poured some magic into them, but now it was time for him to use them. After that, tightly squeezing the mineral in his right hand, he began to pump out blue energy from it, which soon enveloped his entire body. Smiling contentedly, Kim Joo-hyuk was happy, as expected from accumulative stones. They are filled with magical power. Gradually the glow went out, and he, putting it in his pocket, thought again. First he should deal with the remaining pebbles. Should he leave the gold bars here and take the jewelry that weighs less? The next day, upon arriving to study in Valhalla and attending another lesson, Joo-hyuk leaned back in his chair while his whole body trembled and he felt exhausted. Kim Joo-hyuk was so amazed by his condition that it even made him think that if he really thought that he could pull off something like this in the future, then he was probably just a rare idiot. Why can't he feel his muscles after just a few strokes of the shovel? Suddenly Joo-hyuk was forced to interrupt his suffering, and even flinch when Choi Aaron suddenly sat down near his desk. He, stretching his shoulder, which he was now painfully jerking, asked directly what was happening. She, looking at him with a piercing, but at the same time empty look, as always, said, she asks him to teach her the art of wielding a sword. Her persistence scared Kim Joo-hyuk a little, but he tried to hide it, and said tiredly, but she still wouldn't leave him alone, yes? But pursing his lips, he remembered, according to the information he found during his rebirth, the Choijin family, which belongs to Choi Aaron, is engaged in professional fencing. So why does she need him? Then Joo-hyuk decided to ask her about it directly. Why is she asking him so persistently? Her family can train her just as well. Aaron briefly answered that she wanted to learn fencing from him. But he still did not lag behind, and clarified why. Choi Aaron explained a little evasively that she had never seen anyone wield a blade better than him. This made Kim Joo-hyuk feel confused, and he continued to question, what about her father? Isn't he the head of the Choijin family? He must be much better than him, right? Aaron seemed confused and repeated twice, father. Their conversation was interrupted by Kim Lee-gun, who opened the door, looked into their study room and asked Joo-hyuk to go with him to the teacher's room. He asked in surprise, he? Why does he need to go to the teacher's room? Lee-gun explained that this concerns his previous request. Isn't he interested? Kim Joo-hyuk perked up and immediately stood up from his seat, saying that he was on his way. Choi Aaron awkwardly remained standing in place. When he passed by, she tried to turn to him again. She asks for forgiveness. But at first there was no reaction from Joo-hyuk, and she already lowered her head down in despair, when he suddenly announced, tomorrow at 6 o'clock in the morning, she can come to the training ground. Aaron, hearing this at first, was in a stupor. Kim Joo-hyuk hurried to turn around and, looking at her over his shoulder, asked what? Has she already moved on? But she immediately turned her head around and promised that she would definitely come. Soon Joo-hyuk comes to the staff room and stands in front of Lee-gun, who is sitting in the office chair. He says that the lesson will start soon, so he will be brief. Firstly, he was allowed to visit the Constellation room. He needs to go down to the ground floor. Kim Joo-hyuk frowned and asked, is it the ground floor? Kim Lee-gun confirmed this, yes, except for the first floor. Other floors will be closed to him. But he was not upset at all, but turned out to be quite pleased, and replied that he understood the instructor. When can he go there? Lee-gun suggested that if this could be arranged, it would be tonight. Joo-hyuk, of course, did not object, and immediately replied, great, then it's decided. But this behavior made Kim Lee-gun think, this is unexpected. He was sure that the guy was going to cause a scandal because of the ban on visiting the second and subsequent floors. But still, he noted that then Kim Joo-hyuk could go. And this time he only obediently answered, okay. Then turning around, he silently headed out of the teacher's room. With the onset of a starry night, Joo-hyuk and Lee-gun went to the right place, and soon they stopped in front of a building, which was a high tower surrounded by scaffolding, as well as seals in the form of hieroglyphs and chains, and the entrance was guarded. Kim Lee-gun announced that this was the place. Valhalla Academy Treasure, Constellation Room. Kim Joo-hyuk immediately looked around warily. On one side, he saw two men in black sunglasses, formal suits. One of them even had two swords on his back. Looking to the right, he saw two more guards. One man had an extremely angry expression on his face, and his body was protected by a bulletproof vest. Another guard with a pistol on his shoulder muttered something into his walkie-talkie. Joo-hyuk, looking up, noted that the security here was much stricter than at the main gate. Lee-gun, putting one hand on his belt and putting the other in his pocket, replied that of course this would be so, because this is a room of constellations. The unshakable value of this allows Valhalla to be considered one of the 3 great academies. However, Kim Joo-hyuk seemed not to listen to him at all, but continued to look around and took notes to himself, not only the guards, but also the walls outside, Everything was shrouded in a huge concentration of magic. The only place free from magical shackles is the main entrance. Finally, he asked if he could ask the teacher one question. Kim Lee-gun, a little confused, but clarified, "What is the question?" Joo-hyuk said, "How can he get to the second floor? If he ends up there despite the ban, will he certainly become a criminal?" Crossing his arms over his chest and giving him an incredulous look, Lee-gun noted that he would not become a criminal, but the issue of his expulsion would be resolved as soon as possible. Besides, he will lose his mind before he even leaves school. Kim Joo-hyuk immediately asked in surprise, "Will he lose his mind?" Kim Lee-gun explained, "Yes. On the second floor, the incommensurable magical power of the constellations rages. If he comes into contact with this magic, his mind will not be able to withstand such a surge." But after hearing such terrible information, Joo-hyuk smiled, repeating, "He will lose his mind. He will be expelled from the academy." He understood everything. Hearing such a frivolous tone, Lee-gun wondered, wait, why did this guy decide to ask such a question right at the entrance to the room? Is he really going to go down there? No, this is impossible. The first candidate to visit the Constellation Room would not commit such stupidity. He is sure that the guy understands the seriousness of the ban. Finally, the gate opened to let Kim Joo-hyuk in, and Kim Lee-gun rushed to explain that he had 30 minutes, and then he will have to come out.
Today's video ends here. Comment next if you want the next chapter. Like, share, and subscribe for more recaps. Full video available on the channel.